Hi everybody, we're going to talk about transformational form of the sine function as well as the cosine function. They basically have all the same, they do have all the same transformations, just that, and they have the same shape, same amplitude, same period of the original function, just that the cosine function is a shift, a horizontal shift of the sine function. Okay, so let's talk about the two basic functions themselves first. So y equals sine x. The points that you should remember, the 5 major points that you should remember exist on y equals sine x is 0, 0. Okay, so it goes through the origin. We're talking about y equals sine x. 0, 0 is a point on that graph. It goes through the origin. Then a maximum occurs at pi over 2. So pi over 2 and 1 is another point on that graph. Then it comes back through the principal axis at pi, so pi 0 is another point on that graph. And the minimum occurs at 3 pi over 2, so 3 pi over 2 negative 1 is another point on the graph. And then it comes back up here to finish the first period at 2 pi and goes through the principal axis at 2 pi 0. Okay, so definitely remember these 5 major points that are on the y equals sine x graph. Okay, all right. Similarly but different, on the y equals cosine x graph, we have these major points. The maximum is at the y-axis. Okay, so we have this point, 0, 1. Okay. Maybe I should put these beside each other down here. 0, 1. That is a point on y equals cosine of x. At pi over 2, it crosses the principal axis, the x-axis, so pi over 2, 0. At the minimum, it's at pi, so pi, negative 1. Crosses the principal axis again here at 3 pi over 2. So 3 pi over 2 and 0 is a point on that graph. And then it is at the maximum again at 2 pi, so 2 pi 1 is another point on that graph. Definitely remember these 5 major points that exist on y equals cosine of x. Okay, if you remember those 5 points for each of those, you will be able to recreate the pattern in both directions. And let's talk about now the similarities. Similarities, they have the same maximum, okay, 1. They have the same minimum, negative 1. They have the same period, just that that period takes place in a different place, or starts in a different place, finishes in a different place, but the period is 2 pi for both, 2 pi. Okay, so the black graph starts through the origin, and the period is 2 pi. The red graph, cosine x, is at its maximum going through the y-axis, and then starts repeating itself again at 2 pi. So the period is 2 pi for both. The principal axis is also the same for both. The principal axis is the x-axis. The equation for that is y equals 0. Now, over here to transformational form. Transformational form looks exactly the same for both of them. The only difference is the sine, the cosine. All right. So both of these, the A is the vertical stretch if the absolute value of A is greater than 1, or the vertical compression if the absolute value of A is less than 1. So in other words, if not taking into consideration if there's a negative sign there or not, that would represent the reflection. If A is bigger than 1, then it's a vertical stretch. If A is less than 1, or it's a fraction, then a fraction less than 1, then it is a vertical compression. Now, please remember also, if A is negative, reflection in the x-axis. And you saw this in the sine function in your investigations. All right, B represents the horizontal stretch if the absolute value horizontal stretch or compression. I'll just say that for now, and then we'll get more into the details a bit later. Okay, so that's taking that graph and doing this with it like an accordion. Horizontal stretch or compression. And how we find out how big the period, it also tells us the period using this equation for sine and cosine. Period equals 2 pi divided by b. So this is important. Now, it's important to use the correct terminology. B is not the period. B is the horizontal stretch or compression, but it tells us how big the period is based on this equation. Period equals 2 pi divided by b. And this is true for both the sine function and the cosine function. All right, C is the horizontal translation or shift. Translation. So moving that graph one way or the other. And D is the vertical translation. We will be looking at these in more detail and the examples to follow. Have fun!